Welcome to this rapid fire revision deep dive. Look, if you are listening to this right now, you are a resident preparing for your plastic surgery board exams, specifically the FRCS, and, well, you need high yield facts, conceptual clarity, and absolutely no fluff.
Exactly. No time to waste.
Right. So we are jumping straight into penile reconstruction today, but before we get into the heavy lifting, just hit that follow button right now to ensure you don't miss any of our future revision deep dives. And if you find this session helpful for your exam prep, please just take a second to rate the show.
It really helps.
It does. And for those of you who really want to take your preparation to the absolute next level, get a premium subscription. That gives you access to our exclusive journal club and the clinical cases deep dives.
Now you recommend that for the boards.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is a direct, conceptually driven review of the indications, the surgical aims, and specific operative techniques for penile reconstruction. We're going to cover flap options, replantation sequences, all the high-yield stuff.
Right. And the goal here isn't just to memorize a list of facts, It's to really understand the reconstructive logic. If you understand the why, you can navigate any board scenario they throw at you.
Spot on. So when we look at the overarching indications for these procedures, it really seems to split naturally into two very distinct clinical pathways.
Precisely. And for your exams, keeping those two pathways separate in your mind, it dictates everything else that follows. You have to categorize the indications into congenital and acquired groups.
Right, so let's break down the congenital umbrella first.
So under congenital, you are primarily looking at genital ambiguity and gender dysphoria in female-to-male transsexuals.
Okay, and then on the acquired side, the clinical picture completely shifts.
It's completely different. Here, the primary indications you need to list are traumatic amputation, oncological amputation, and severe infection.
And the surgical approach you choose is obviously going to be wildly different depending on whether you're dealing with, say, a congenital anatomical variation or the catastrophic tissue loss of an acquired amputation.
Exactly.
But before a surgeon even decides on a specific flap or technique, there has to be a consensus on what we are actually trying to achieve. The literature consistently points to 4 core aims of surgical reconstruction here.
Yes, and it's fascinating because these goals often compete against one another anatomically.
They really do. It makes this area of reconstructive surgery incredibly complex.
It does. The fundamental goals are very specific. And while your choice of technique largely depends on that initial indication we just talked about, universally, you are trying to satisfy 4 main aims.
Let's run through them for the listeners taking notes.
Number 1 is to create a knee urethra to allow urination while standing.
Crucial functional goal.
Right. Number 2 is to provide tactile and erogenous sensibility. Number 3 is to allow for the insertion of a prosthetic stiffener if it's required. And number 4 is to achieve an aesthetically acceptable result for the patient.
It's just a massive reconstructive burden when you think about it. Trying to achieve a functionally patent conduit for standing mixerition while simultaneously ensuring enough sensate feedback to prevent pressure necrosis from a stiffener.
All while making it look aesthetically natural.
Exactly. It requires an incredible synthesis of tissue engineering and microvascular skill. So let's look at how we actually achieve these goals, starting with the congenital scenarios. Let's say a patient presents with ambiguous genitalia, specifically a small but complete micropenis. The strategy isn't necessarily total reconstruction right out of the gate, is it?
No, not usually. It's more about maximizing what is already anatomically present. And what's interesting here is how much you can actually achieve with local anatomical manipulation.
Right.
If the micropenis is small but complete, you basically have 3 specific surgical maneuvers at your disposal to increase its prominence without resorting to free tissue transfer.
So what's the first maneuver?
First, you can mobilize the corpora cavernosa directly from the pubic rami. You are essentially releasing the anatomical tethering to bring more of the shaft forward.
Releasing the tether.
Yep.
Got it. And the second?
Second, you accentuate the penoscrotal angle. And third, you reduce the surrounding pubic fat.
That reduction of pubic fat and the accentuation of the angle, it's almost a visual trick combined with a functional release, right? You are maximizing the existing anatomical length visually by simply changing the landscape around it.
Exactly. It's a very elegant solution when the anatomy allows for it.
But what happens when we move to congenital indications in female-to-male transsexuals? Because the approach completely shifts there. If we look at the metadoyoplasty, the actual surgical intervention is really only half the story.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of comprehensive patient care, The absolute necessity of medical sequencing before surgical intervention is what stands out for the boards.
Right, you can't just jump straight into the operating room.
You cannot. Surgery for a metadoiplasty normally follows a dedicated course of hormonal treatment. This hormonal therapy is required to deliberately overdevelop the clitoris.
And once that medical optimization is achieved and the tissue has responded,
Then the surgical procedure itself involves the elongation and displacement of the clitoris to construct a microphallus.
here's where it gets really interesting regarding the functional reconstruction. You have this newly elongated microphallus. But going back to our 4 core aims, you still have to address the functional requirement of the urethra. How is that central conduit built into this displaced tissue?
This is a highly specific, high-yield detail for your exams. Crucially, the urethra must be lengthened all the way to the tip of this newly constructed microphallus.
And the tissue used for that.
To achieve this, the standard technique utilizes an anterior musculomucosal vaginal flap.
An anterior musculomucosal vaginal flap. It is such an elegant anatomical solution because you absolutely need a mucosal lining to handle the physiological demands of a urinary conduit.
Exactly, you need the right tissue for the right job.
But every procedure has its trade-offs. Part of the board exam is proving you can counsel a patient through the realities of these surgeries. What are the key advantages and disadvantages of a metadoiplasty that a resident must be ready to articulate?
Let's start with the advantages, which are primarily sensory and aesthetic. The most significant benefit is that this procedure maintains erogenous sensitivity.
Because you are utilizing the native hormonally stimulated tissue.
Precisely. Additionally, it avoids the extensive, highly visible scarring that is inevitably associated with more complex reconstructive techniques like free flaps.
Which is a huge psychological benefit for the patient. But the functional limitations are quite severe.
They are substantial, and this is where your preoperative counseling is tested in an exam setting. This procedure creates a very short phallus, which usually will not allow for sexual intercourse.
Right.
Furthermore, and this is a critical statistic you need to know, 50% of these patients will still be unable to void while standing.
Wow. That 50% statistic is a stark reality check. Imagine sitting across from a patient. You have to explain that even after the hormonal therapy and the surgical elongation, there is a coin flip chance they still won't achieve that primary functional goal of standing micturition.
It perfectly highlights why metadoiplasty, despite maintaining sensation and minimizing scars, isn't the final answer for everyone.
So what does this all mean when a patient requires or desires a more substantial reconstruction? We have to look at total penile reconstruction. Historically, surgeons were trying all sorts of pedicled options, weren't they?
Yes, historically you will see descriptions of tube pedicled flaps and pedicled gracilis flaps in the literature.
Just try and bring enough bulk to the area.
Right, they were foundational attempts to solve a massive tissue defect. However, the paradigm shifted significantly. For total penile reconstruction today, the most common methods utilized involve forearm flaps.
The absolute workhorse. Let's break down the free radial forearm flap, often referred to in the literature as the Chinese method, right? First described by Chang and Huang in 1984.
It completely changed the game.
While the skin paddle design is subject to a lot of modifications depending on the surgeon, the core structural design required to build this anatomy is fascinating. It's essentially an origami exercise with human tissue.
It really is an exercise in complex spatial geometry. The foundational plan for the radial forearm flap in this context relies on creating a tube within a tube.
A tube within a tube.
Yes. This specific architecture is completely necessary to allow for the formation of the urethra alongside the main shaft. You are taking a flat plane of tissue and rolling it to create a central conduit, and then rolling the remaining tissue around that to create the external structure.
And regarding that inner tube, the urethra, you can't just use any part of the forearm skin. There's a very specific anatomical preference that examiners love to ask about.
Absolutely. The urethra is usually tubed specifically from ulnar skin.
And the clinical rationale there.
It's straightforward, but vital. The ulnar skin is generally much less hairy.
Right.
This is a critical consideration because if you incorporate hair-bearing skin into the mucosal lining of a urinary conduit, you are setting the patient up for chronic complications. Hair will act as a nidus for stone formation and lead to recurrent, severe urinary tract infections.
Less hairy ulnar skin for the inner tube to prevent stones. It is a perfect example of form following function. Now let's talk about structural integrity. We have a tube of skin, but going back to our four aims, it needs rigidity, and it needs a robust blood supply to survive the transfer. When we are bringing this free flap down, how are those two elements addressed?
To provide the necessary rigidity, you have to build a skeleton into the flap. You can incorporate either a piece of the radius from the donor site or a segment of harvested costal cartilage into the flap design.
Okay, and for the vascular hookup?
Once the flap is transferred to the recipient site, it is usually revascularized using the deep inferior epigastric vessels.
Hooking up to the deep inferior epigastrics provides a highly reliable, large-caliber vascular supply. But survival of the tissue isn't enough. We have to talk about sensation, which ties directly back to providing tactile and erogenous sensibility. If we are using a radial forearm flap, what are the crucial neural coaptations required to bring that tissue to life?
You need to surgically include the lateral and medial antebrachial cutaneous nerves when you harvest your flap.
And what do we connect those to?
Once transferred, these antebrachial nerves are then coapted directly to the dorsal nerves of the penis or the clitoris, depending entirely on the patient's native anatomy and the indication for the surgery.
But anatomy doesn't always cooperate. If we are dealing with a severe traumatic amputation or a radical oncological resection, those local dorsal nerves might be completely unavailable or insufficient. We need a backup plan to establish that neural circuit.
If the dorsal nerves are unavailable, you are not out of options, but it requires an extra complex step. You must use an interposition nerve graft.
To bridge the gap.
Exactly. This nerve graft acts as a vital bridge to cross the anatomical gap and reach a pudendal nerve. Without bridging that gap, you cannot ensure sensory innervation is established.
This raises an incredibly important question regarding the management of these patients postoperatively, specifically regarding prosthetic stiffeners. Surgeons love to fix the structural problem, but there is an absolute rule regarding the timing of inserting a prosthetic stiffener into these flaps.
This is a non-negotiable reconstructive principle and a classic exam trap. The flap must have established demonstrable protective sensation prior to the use of any prosthetic stiffeners.
Protective sensation first, always, because the mechanical consequences otherwise are disastrous, right?
Catastrophic.
Right.
If you place a rigid prosthesis into a completely insensate flap, the patient cannot feel the internal pressure the stiffener exerts on the tissue.
Which means no warning signs.
Exactly. The risk of pressure necrosis, tissue breakdown, and eventual extrusion of the prosthesis is exceptionally high. You must wait for neural ingrowth. Protective sensation must be present first.
I cannot emphasize that enough for you listening. Sensation before prosthetics. It is a golden rule. Now, despite its incredible versatility, its ability to be designed as a tube within a tube, and its reliable vascularity, the radial forearm flap is not perfect. What is the greatest disadvantage of utilizing this technique?
The primary drawback, and it is a significant one, is donor site morbidity. Specifically, it leaves a highly prominent donor site defect on the forearm.
Very hard to hide.
Extremely difficult to conceal. It often requires skin grafting and can be highly aesthetically displeasing for the patient. This requires incredibly careful preoperative counseling so the patient understands they are trading a hidden defect for a highly visible one.
That is the reality of reconstructive surgery robbing Peter to pay Paul. And because of that prominent donor site, or perhaps due to an inadequate Allen's test or previous forearm trauma, you cannot walk into a board exam with only one tool in your box. If the radial forearm flap isn't suitable, you need a deep bench. What alternative free flaps should a resident be ready to discuss and defend?
You should have 3 solid alternative free flaps ready to articulate. First, the free sensate osteocutaneous fibula flap. Second, the free scapular flap. And third, the infraumbilical flap.
I want to pause on the free sensate osteocutaneous fibula flap because it introduces a concept that examiners absolutely love to dive into.
Yes, what's fascinating about the fibula option is the concept of prelamination. With this technique, the flap can actually be prelaminated with a tubed skin graft beforehand to form an urethra.
For anyone whose brain just skipped a beat on prelamination, that is the highly sophisticated, staged approach where you literally build the urethra into the flap with a skin graft while it is still attached to the leg.
Right, you let it mature.
You let it mature, establish a blood supply from the surrounding tissue, and then in a subsequent stage, you harvest the entire composite structure. It is a brilliant way to ensure the inner tube is viable before you ever disconnect the blood supply.
It really is.
So keep the fibula flap with prelamination, the scapular flap, and the infraumbilical flap loaded in your memory as your primary alternatives. Finally, let's shift our focus to the acquired indications, specifically traumatic amputations. When a patient rolls through the emergency department doors, how do we assess the prognosis and what is the exact operative sequence for a penile replantation?
When assessing the prognosis of a traumatic amputation, you can draw a direct clinical parallel to finger replantation. The mechanism of injury dictates everything.
Meaning clean cuts do better.
Yes, sharp, non-avulsive injuries will always have the best prognosis. Conversely, avulsive or crush injuries have a significantly poorer outlook due to the extensive zone of injury, massive intimal damage to the vessels, and tissue loss.
So let's assume the best case scenario. We have a clean, sharp amputation. The patient is on the operating table, the ischemic time is acceptable, and we are ready to go. If I'm visualizing the replantation sequence, the instinct might be to rush straight to the microvascular anastomosis to restore blood flow and minimize ischemia. But the literature insists on a very different first step.
The sequence is highly protocolized and must be strictly adhered to. You do not start with the vessels. First, you must perform a spatulated urethral repair over a urethral catheter.
Why the urethra first? Why delay reperfusion?
Because repairing the urethra over that indwelling catheter provides a stable central platform for the rest of your microvascular and neural repairs.
Ah, so it's mechanical support.
Exactly. If you try to anastomose tiny vessels first, the two halves of the amputated tissue are completely mobile. The lack of structural stability makes the microsurgery incredibly difficult, if not impossible, and risks tearing your delicate repairs.
It is exactly like building the central pillar of a house before you attempt to do any of the delicate plumbing or electrical work. You need that spatulated urethral repair over a catheter to act as your foundational strut. Once that stable platform is established, what is step 2?
With the structure stabilized, you then move to revascularization. You perform the microsurgical anastomosis of the vessels. Specifically, you need to identify and anastomose the 2 dorsal arteries and the single dorsal vein.
2 dorsal arteries, 1 dorsal vein. Blood flow is restored. Step 3.
Step 3 is the neural repair. You must carefully co-opt the paired dorsal nerves to restore that vital protective and erogenous sensation we discussed earlier.
And the final step to complete this meticulous replantation sequence.
Finally, you repair the tunica albuginea of the corpora cavernosa, which encapsulates the erectile tissue and completes the structural repair.
Let's review that sequence for everyone taking notes. 1. Spatulated urethral repair over a catheter for a stable platform. 2. Microsurgical anastomosis of 2 dorsal arteries and 1 dorsal vein. 3. Coaptation of the paired dorsal nerves. 4. Repair of the tunica albuginea of the corpora cavernosa. That sequence needs to be automatic.
It does.
We have covered a tremendous amount of dense, high-yield material today, from navigating the competing aims of reconstruction to the nuances of metadoyoplasty, the biomechanical brilliance of the tube-in-a-tube forearm flap, and the strict, unforgiving replantation sequence.
If we connect this to the broader landscape of board preparation, mastering these foundational steps, understanding the why behind the sequences, and being able to articulate the clinical trade-offs is what separates a truly prepared candidate from one who has merely memorized a textbook.
Exactly. Understanding the logic makes the facts unforgettable. Before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. As you study these established, complex techniques, like the prelaminated fibula flap or the intricate nerve coaptations required for the forearm flap, consider how these principles might serve as the foundation for future tissue-engineered solutions in reconstructive urology.
A fascinating area of growth.
Imagine a future where we aren't borrowing skin and bone from the arm or leg, but rather utilizing lab-grown, pre-innervated mucosal conduits. The concepts of prelamination and nerve coaptation we use today are the exact stepping stones toward that reality. It is something really interesting to keep in mind as the field evolves and as you step into your roles as consultant surgeons. That is all for this revision deep dive. Please leave a comment or a question about today's deep dive in the discussion section. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these techniques. Keep studying hard, trust your preparation, and we will see you on the next one. Goodbye.